In this video, let's understanding the auto wiring concept in Spring in detail. To understand auto wiring in detail, we would also need to understand dependency injection. So we would start off with dependency injection, and then we try to understand how auto wiring really works. We try to understand the basics of auto wiring, and then we would move on to the types of auto wiring like setters, get constructors, and also by using reflection. So how auto wiring is done, what are the different ways in which you can do auto wiring in Spring. The specific class which we would be using in this particular example is dependency injection examples, which is in the project one basic example. In 28 minutes, we really focus on creating tutorials with hands-on examples. So we do a little bit of setup before we do get into the real concept. So have a little bit of patience and let's get started.
Hi there. Now let's discuss about the important annotations in Spring Framework. I have about 10 to 12 years of experience using Spring. The first version of Spring, there were no annotations present, and everything had to be wired together using very, very tedious XML configuration. We had XMLs which were running into 500 to 600 lines. They were as big as some large Java files. And that was one of the biggest maintenance headaches, because whenever I want to auto-wire something, I have to do that manually in a XML. And it was a very, very tedious thing to maintain. And thereafter, annotations came in, and with annotations, everything becomes very easy. The thing about annotations is, as long as you don't understand them, they seem very difficult. But once you understand them, they are very easy. They are your friends. So in this video, we'll look at some of the important annotations in Spring Framework. We would only focus on the basic ones. For more complete reference onto all the annotations, probably you can look at the complete Spring tutorial, the link to which would be below the video in the description. The annotations which we'll talk about during this particular video are, first we'll begin with component, next we'll talk about auto wired, configuration, component scan, run with, and context configuration. So these are the six annotations that we would talk during this particular video. Let's start with component. The Spring Framework wants to know which are the things that needs to be maintained by the IOC container. Which are the beans whose life cycle needs to be maintained by the Spring IOC container. The way you tell that to the Spring Framework is by putting something called a component. So it's at component. In the example that we are looking at, we have an interface, hi service. So hi service is basically a simple interface which has a method called say hi. And we also have a good morning service IMPL, which implements the hi service, which returns good morning. So what we want is, we want to test the good morning service in this particular unit test and see if we are able to auto wire the good morning service IMPL to the hi service in here. So we want to auto wire the good morning service which is in here. It's an implementation of hi service, so it should be a candidate to get auto wired in here. So we would want to auto wire it to the hi service in here. So I would want to tell the Spring Framework that this good morning service IMPL is one of the components or one of the beans that I would want to load. How do I do that? I do that by putting an at component. So if you look at the package, it's org Spring Framework stereotype component. Once you put an at component on a particular class, on a particular implementation of an interface, then that component would be loaded up by Spring and would be cut. and the life cycle of that particular component would be managed by Spring. So basically, you can kind of think add component as a way of I saying I want to be managed by Spring. So whoever wants to be managed by Spring framework, whoever wants to be managed by the Spring IOC container, can raise their hands up by putting an add component and themselves. The next important annotation in terms of the Spring annotations are at AutoWire. Now, in this particular thing, good morning service IMPL is saying I'm available. I'm ready to be used by putting an add component on top of it. But who is going to use it? That's basically the at AutoWired. So when we put an at AutoWired on top of any particular member variable, or it can be on top of a constructor, or it can be on top of a setter method. In all the cases, what we are telling Spring is, we are saying, Spring, one of the beans that you are managing would match the high service. So there would be a lot of things which would be annotated with at component or at service. Try and look at all of them and find the right match for us and make it available in here. That's basically the at AutoWired annotation. At AutoWired annotation is this particular class is telling Spring, this is telling Spring among the components that are being managed by you, whichever one matches my definition. The matches is a kind of a tricky thing. The match can be an interface. So it can be, if this is an interface, then a match can be any implementation of that interface. And also if there are multiple implementations of this interface, then even the variable name, so service, can also be used as a match. So at AutoWired is a way a class tells to Spring that I want this dependency of mine to be AutoWired. I want you to search among your components and AutoWire the correct dependency to me. That's basically what we are telling to Spring with the at AutoWired annotation. At AutoWired and at components are the most frequently used annotations in Spring framework. The next important annotation is configuration. So I want to run an application which is managed by Spring application context. So I want to launch up a Spring application context. Earlier, we used to have a lot of application contexts which were launched using XMLs. But now, with the advances in annotations, you can launch up an application context by using a Java class. That's what is add configuration. Add configuration is the way I would tell that this Java context is a application, is a context configuration. So basically we are saying this is having all the configuration for a particular context. How do I do that? Is by putting an annotation at configuration. As you can see, it's org Spring Framework context annotation configuration. So indicates that a class declares one or more bean methods and may be processed by a Spring container to generate bean definitions. Basically, the way you can think of it is whatever we used to have earlier in Spring XML definitions, you can now have in this particular context. And this at configuration is the one which makes this particular class a Spring context configuration. And as part of add configuration, one of the important configurations that we put as part of configurations is the component scan. And that's the next annotation. A component scan specifies where the Spring framework needs to search for components. Earlier, we saw good morning service IMPL said, I'm a component, right? Like that, there might be thousands of classes which might announce themselves as components. Do you want to load all of them? And Spring, if you load thousands of unneeded classes, then it might be a performance impact. So the component scan specifies what are the packages that we need to scan for finding components. So basically what Spring does is it takes this package, and in this particular package, what our classes are there. So in this package and the sub packages of this package, in this package and the sub packages of this package, Spring searches for components, and those are the ones which would be used to run this particular program. And that is what is specified by using a at component scan. Again, you would see that it's inside all Spring Framework context annotation. So this is one of the critical things in writing, one of the critical things to understand when writing Spring applications, because when you want to run both tests and the real code as part of, let's say, a web application, the only difference between those two things might be a component scan. When you do a component scan on the web application, you would load all the real code. And when you do the component scan on the test, when you are doing the component scan in a test class, probably you want to load the stubs. So component scan is quite an important thing where we specify what are the packages where the Spring Framework scans for to find components or services. The run with is not really a Spring Framework annotation, but the reason why I put it in here is because this Spring JUnit 4 class runner is a Spring defined class. So if you look at the Spring JUnit 4 class runner, this is actually part of the Spring test. So this is part of the org Spring Framework test. When you have a unit test and you would want the unit test to be run with a Spring context, the way you specify that is by using the @runwith Spring JUnit 4 class runner. When you use @runwith Spring JUnit 4 class runner, it allows you to have another annotation on it. So the other annotation specifies what is the context to use. So @context configuration specifies what application context this unit test uses to run. In this particular example, we are using a Java context. So we are saying classes is equal to Java test context. So Java test context is the thing in here. So the Java test context is used to run this particular unit test. So basically, the way we have done it is, if you look at this dependency injection Java test, Java context examples it's called, but it's really a JUnit test. What it does is it uses @runwith Spring JUnit 4 class runner. So it says, I want to run a Spring context. The next question is what context? The context is Java test context. And Java test context, a context asks, how do I load all the components? The way you specify that is by using an @component scan. So, and what Spring does, it goes through all the classes in this particular packages and it will load them as beans. And among the classes like this, you would have a few dependencies, and those dependencies would be auto-wired in by the Spring framework. And later, when we run the dummy test in here, you would see that when I run this particular program, run as JUnit test, you would see that the service.sayHi method would return good morning. The most important thing in here is I'm not doing a new good morning service IMPL. So, if I did that, then I don't really need to do Spring. I don't need Spring. I want the dependencies to be managed by Spring and auto-wired in. So that's why we put @auto-wired, and all the configuration that we have in here, not really a lot. We talked about 15-20 minutes, but all that there is about 10 to 15 lines of code, nothing more than that. So this is how Spring helps us use annotations, and this is how Spring helps us to write very good, testable, and maintainable code. This particular example, the code for this particular example is in GitHub. You can look up the repository. It's in the GitHub repository in 28 minutes, and there's a project called Spring in 28 minutes. In here is also a lot of other examples related to Spring Framework, 7 different projects. Also, there's an installation guide to help you install Java, Eclipse, and Maven. Also, you will find here how you can install the examples of this particular tutorial, how you can import the Maven projects and get everything set up, and also links to all the other tutorials that we have as part of this particular course. The specific example that we are looking at is dependency injection Java context example, and it's present in the Spring basic example project. So it's present in the basic example, which is 1. So if you just want to look at this particular example, probably you can go to this particular path and you can import this project. And
hope you had a good time learning Spring in this particular tutorial. You will find more examples about dependency injection, inversion of control, Spring modules, JDBC, aspect-oriented programming, MVC, and a lot of that kind of examples on our Git repository, as well as links to a number of video tutorials. You'd find a list of more than 10 videos which you can look at to understand Spring even more on the GitHub repository. What's stopping you? Just go down there, look at all the examples, and become an expert on Spring. And by the way, do not forget to subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.